My name is Jessica Miller, and I still remember the weight of that mahogany-paneled room the day my parents read the will. The air smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. My sister sat at the table, her fingers already curling possessively around a crystal glass of champagne. The lawyer cleared his throat, and in the next breath, my parents handed her $10 million, then turned to me with a smile that cut deeper than any blade. Go earn your own. The words didn't just land, they burned. Every gaze in the room shifted, and I could feel their silent judgment pressing in. My hands stayed on my lap, but my mind was already moving quietly, deliberately, toward a future they couldn't see coming. I didn't say a word. Silence, I'd learned, was often sharper than any outburst. The lawyer's voice droned on about trust tax implications and the formal transfer of assets. My sister's laughter, soft and smug, slipped between the sentences like a knife through silk. She didn't even try to hide her triumph. My parents avoided my eyes, flipping through documents, as if the ink itself mattered more than their daughter sitting across from them. I studied them in return. My father's hair, once thick, had thinned to a harsh comb-over. My mother's pearls gleamed under the chandelier, every bit as cold as the look she gave me. When the last paper was signed, my sister leaned back in her chair, champagne glass in hand, and said, "Guess this makes things official." I smiled, small-controlled. It does. The room quieted, the kind of pause that asks a question without words. I stood smoothing my skirt and reached for my coat draped over the back of the chair. My movements were deliberate, unhurried, the way you close a chapter you never intend to read again. The lawyer glanced at me. "Miss Miller, would you like a copy of the no?" I said, cutting him off gently. "I won't need it." I walked toward the door, my heels muted against the thick carpet. Just as I reached the threshold, I felt my sister's eyes on me, heavy with the satisfaction of someone who thinks they've won. I didn't give her the courtesy of looking back. Outside, the late afternoon sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the city skyline in copper and shadow. The air tasted of exhaust and early winter. I stood on the curb for a moment, letting the cold settle into my bones, letting it ground me. It wasn't anger driving me, it was clarity. They thought they'd close the book on me today, but I knew better. This was only the preface. When the driver pulled up, I slid into the back seat, the leather cool against my skin. "Where to, ma'am?" he asked. I gave him the address. Not to an apartment, not to any place they knew I lived, but to an office with my name on the door, one they didn't know existed. I watched the city blur past the faintest curl of a smile on my lips. They'd told me to earn my own. I already had. The elevator doors opened to the 34th floor, revealing a quiet lobby with a panoramic view of the city. A receptionist looked up her face, breaking into a professional smile. "Good evening, Ms. Miller," she said. I nodded and walked past her into my office, floor-to-ceiling windows, minimalist furniture, and the faint hum of machines in the server room next door. My desk was bare, except for a single silver frame, a photograph of a small coastal town at dawn. The place I'd gone to rebuild myself after my family made it clear I was nothing to them. I hung my coat powered on my computer and began reviewing the quarterly reports. Numbers had always been my quiet language, one my parents never cared to understand. They valued showmanship and appearances. I valued precision and results. 7 years ago, I'd walked out of their lives with nothing but a second-hand laptop and a rented basement apartment. I worked 2 jobs days as a junior analyst at a small investment firm, nights coding freelance for clients who didn't know or care about my last name. The days blurred into years, but each late night taught me how to read markets, how to spot shifts before they happened, how to turn $1,000 into $10,000 without flashing it on social media. Tonight, the reports confirmed what I already knew. My company had just closed a deal that would put us in the top 5 firms in the region. Quietly, without headlines or applause, I'd built something my parents could never buy, independence that couldn't be taken away. My phone buzzed. A message from my operations director, client dinner confirmed for tomorrow, location sent to your calendar. I typed a brief reply and leaned back in my chair. The irony wasn't lost on me. Tomorrow's dinner would be at the same luxury restaurant where my parents had once forgotten to invite me to my sister's engagement party. Back then, I'd been nursing a bruised ego and a cheap glass of wine alone in my apartment. Tomorrow, I'd be the one hosting. I stood by the window, watching the city's lights flicker on one by one. Somewhere out there, my family was probably celebrating their latest victory, blissfully unaware that the ground beneath them had already shifted. They thought they'd left me behind, but I'd been ahead of them for years. The next morning, I was in the middle of a budget review when my assistant buzzed in. "There's someone here to see you," she said, her tone cautious. "She says it's urgent." I frowned. "Who, Pause. "Your mother." For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of my computer fan. I hadn't seen her in years, not since the will reading. I could have told my assistant to send her away. But instead, I closed the file on my screen and said, "Let her in." The door opened, and there she was, perfectly tailored pearls around her neck, the same faint perfume I remembered from childhood. She took in the office with a quick sweep of her eyes, masking whatever surprise she might have felt. "Jessica," she said like the name tasted strange on her tongue. "Mother," I replied, my voice neutral. She sat without being asked, crossing her legs. "Your sister is getting married," she said as if this were breaking news. "We're hosting a dinner tomorrow for close family and important guests." She hesitated. "We'd like you to be there." It was almost laughable. Years of silence, and now they wanted me at a table they once made sure I couldn't approach. I tilted my head slightly. "Why now?" Her eyes flickered just for a second. "It would mean a lot to your sister." I didn't bother pointing out the lie. "Fine," I said, leaning back. "Text me the details." The corner of her mouth twitched, maybe irritation, maybe relief. She rose, gave the room one last glance, and left without another word. When the door shut, I exhaled slowly. I wasn't naive enough to think this was an olive branch. It was a move on their part, an attempt to control a narrative I hadn't even stepped into yet. But they didn't know the dinner was already on my calendar. Not as a family obligation, but as a client engagement, which meant tomorrow I wouldn't be arriving as the daughter they dismissed. I'd be arriving as the person signing the contracts that kept that very restaurant in business. As the sun dipped below the skyline that evening, I thought about the seating arrangements, the introductions, the way eyes would shift when my name was announced in a different context than they'd ever heard before. They had built a world where I didn't belong. Tomorrow, I'd walk right into it and own the room. The restaurant's valet lane glowed under soft golden lights. I stepped out of the black town car, the chill of early evening brushing against my skin. The maitre d' noticed me instantly, his expression brightening. "Ms. Miller," he said warmly, "your table is ready. Right this way." The sound of my heels against the polished marble floor was steady, deliberate. I could feel the eyes of a few patrons turn my way, not out of recognition, but because presence can speak louder than introductions. The private dining room was set in warm amber light, the long table dressed in white linen and crystal. At the far end, my family was gathered, my sister, in an ivory silk dress, my parents seated like hosts of a royal banquet. Their laughter faltered when they saw me. "Jessica," my father, said, his tone polite but distant. "You made it." I smiled faintly and took the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, across from the man who would soon be my client. He stood extending his hand with a genuine grin. "Jessica Miller. I've heard a lot about you." My parents exchanged a glance, confusion flickering, but they said nothing. Conversation flowed around the table, most of it light and shallow. I answered when spoken to, keeping my tone measured. I watched my sister, basking in attention, drop subtle remarks about her incredible fiancé and their future together. It was theater, the kind they'd perfected. Midway through the first course, the restaurant's general manager entered the room. He approached me, directly, bending slightly. "Ms. Miller, the contract is ready for your review whenever you're ready. We'll accommodate any changes you request." The room went still. My father's fork froze halfway to his mouth. My sister blinked, the faintest crease forming between her brows. I offered the manager a nod. "I'll look it over after dessert." The conversation stumbled, then resumed in a forced rhythm. But the shift had happened the first hairline crack in the image they'd tried so hard to maintain. I didn't press. Not yet. Sometimes the most effective move is letting the silence do the work. And in that silence, I could feel control beginning to tilt. By the time the main course arrived, the polite mask my sister wore had started to strain. She leaned forward, her voice pitched just high enough for the nearby guests to hear. "So, Jessica, what exactly is it that you do these days?" Still, finding your way, the jab was dressed in sugar, but it landed with the same intention as always, to reduce me to the girl they'd told to go earn her own. I didn't rush to answer. Instead, I reached for my wine, letting the pause stretch. "I run a private acquisitions firm," I said finally, my tone even. "We identify undervalued assets and restructure them for long-term stability." Her fiancé laughed lightly. "Sounds technical." Before I could respond, the man across from me, the very reason I was here, spoke up. "Technical, yes, but profitable. Jessica's firm is the one acquiring the portfolio that includes this restaurant group." Every head turned toward me. My father's jaw tightened. "You're buying?" The controlling stake the man confirmed, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Her team's already handled 2 of our key properties. This will be the 3rd. The words hung in the air like a drawn bowstring. My sister blinked rapidly, her fingers tightening around her glass. "That's interesting," my mother managed, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "It's business," I said softly, setting my glass down. "And business has a way of crossing paths with the past." The general manager reappeared at my side, holding a leather folder. "Whenever you're ready, Ms. Miller." I glanced toward my family, then took the folder. My pen moved across the final page, the ink dark and deliberate. When I slid it back, the manager's smile widened. "Congratulations," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's official." Somewhere in the room, a champagne cork popped. The sound seemed to echo. My parents sat frozen in place, the balance of the evening irrevocably shifted. I leaned back, letting the moment breathe. They had wanted me here to play a role. Instead, I had rewritten the scene entirely. And I wasn't finished yet. The plates for dessert were being cleared when the restaurant's sommelier entered with a bottle cradled in his arms like a priceless artifact. He approached our table, addressing the client beside me first. "As per your request, sir, we've prepared the 1982 Chateau Lafite for this evening compliments of Ms. Miller." A few nearby tables glanced over at the sound of the wine's name. My father's eyes snapped to mine. "You brought that in, I own it," I replied simply. "Seller acquisitions come with certain privileges." The sommelier uncorked the bottle with ceremonial precision, pouring a taste into my glass first. The aroma of aged oak and dark berries drifted upward, rich and unmistakable. I took a slow sip, savoring it not for the flavor alone, but for the silence that followed. It was my sister who broke it. "So all this time, while we thought you were..." She stopped herself, biting back the word. Struggling, I offered my tone calm. "That's the thing about assumptions. They usually serve the one making them, not the one being judged." The client chuckled, glancing at me with admiration. "Jessica, when the board heard you'd take over, they called it the smartest move we've made in years." The words were casual, but the impact was surgical. My parents shifted in their chairs, the full weight of the evening beginning to press on them. A few guests had started whispering. I could feel the current in the room change. This was no longer just a family dinner. It had become a public stage. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the tablecloth. "I didn't come here to gloat," I said quietly. "But I also didn't come here to sit quietly in the shadow you built for me." The general manager returned one last time, placing an embossed envelope in front of me. "The welcome package for the new owner," he said with a subtle bow. My sister's fork clinked against her plate. My father's lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came. I slid the envelope aside without opening it, letting them sit with the knowledge of what it meant. The power they'd once held so tightly had slipped piece by piece across the table into my hands. And the night wasn't over. The clink of glassware and the low hum of conversation began to rise again, but there was a tension threaded through it, now a collective awareness that something had shifted. The client beside me pushed his chair back and rose glass in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying easily over the tables. "If I may have a moment." The room quieted. Even the waitstaff paused in their movements. "It's not often," he continued, "that I get to witness a business transition handled with such precision and discretion. Tonight marks the official change of ownership for this entire restaurant group, and the new majority owner is—" He turned to me with a smile that was equal parts respect and pride. "Jessica Miller." It was as though every sound in the room froze mid-air. Forks hovered above plates, glasses stilled mid-sip. My parents' faces drained of color, my sister's lips parting, as if to form a protest she couldn't quite voice. A wave of murmurs rolled through the guests, my name repeated, in hushed, incredulous tones. I stood not hurriedly, but with the same measured calm I'd carried since walking in. "Thank you," I said, my voice steady. "This isn't just a business for me. It's about building something that lasts, something resilient." I let my gaze move deliberately across the room, settling briefly on my family. And sometimes the people you least expect are the ones who can make that happen. Polite applause began scattered at first, then growing as more guests joined in. The sound was a physical thing pushing against the carefully curated hierarchy my family had built around themselves for years. My father's hands rested stiffly on the table. My mother looked everywhere but at me. My sister tried to force a smile, but it flickered like a candle in wind. The general manager approached with a sleek black folder. "If you'd like, Ms. Miller, we can move your private office to the upstairs suite by next week." His words were loud enough for the nearest tables to catch. I inclined my head. "That will be fine." From the far corner, a photographer apparently on hand for another event snapped a frame. The flash caught the moment in stark relief, me, standing tall, glass in hand. My family seated, still absorbing the reality that the girl they dismissed now owned the floor beneath their feet. The applause tapered off, replaced by an undercurrent of conversation I didn't need to hear to understand. The narrative had changed right here, right now, in front of them all. I sat back down, my pulse steady. This wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about reclamation, about taking back the space they'd told me I didn't deserve. And judging by the way they now avoided my eyes, they understood that better than anyone. The rest of the evening moved in fragments, half-heard conversations, the occasional clink of cutlery, and my family's stilted attempts at small talk that dissolved before they reached my ears. The power balance had shifted, and we all knew it. When the coffee was served, I thanked the client and the general manager, then rose from my seat. My chair scraped softly against the floor, but it might as well have been a thunderclap. My father glanced up, but he didn't speak. My mother's gaze stayed fixed on her untouched dessert. I set my linen napkin neatly on the table. "It was good to see you all," I said, my tone even neither warm nor cold, just final. "I have an early morning meeting." My sister's voice cracked on my name. "Jessica." I looked at her, not with anger, but with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally stopped chasing approval. "You don't have to say anything," I told her. "You already said enough years ago." For a moment, there was only silence between us, thick with everything that had been unsaid for too long. Then I turned, walking toward the exit. The soft hum of the restaurant swelled behind me, the conversations picking up again now that the scene had passed. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of rain. My driver stepped forward to open the car door, but I paused on the sidewalk, looking back at the glow of the restaurant windows. Somewhere inside, my family was sitting in the very space they had once believed was theirs to rule, now firmly under my control. It wasn't triumph I felt. It was release. The years of being dismissed, underestimated, and excluded had ended not with a shouted argument or a dramatic scene, but with a signature, a contract, and a steady refusal to be diminished. I slid into the back seat, closing the door behind me. As the car pulled away, I let the city lights blur into gold and silver streams against the glass. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about what they had taken from me. I was thinking about what I had built for myself, and that was worth more than any inheritance.